So Levi, I'm going to read a piece from my translations of Rav Kook, from the Spiritual Revolution of Rav Kook, and then we're going to discuss it. So this is called "We Have Neglected the Individual." It's from Orot, Yisrael 7:17. Okay. It is impossible for us to speak about a national revolution if we do not first speak about the revolution of each unique individual. In fact, the neglected revolution of the individual soul is what is truly holding us back from a national revolution. Okay, what are your thoughts on this piece? What do you think Rav Kook is getting at here?
Well, I think that you can look at a collective group of people in basically two ways. That you can either see the collective as essentially a sort of loose structure composed of individuals. You have all these individuals who, because of something they have in common, they all choose to work together or all happen to work together. But it's essentially about individuals. Or you can look at the collective group as a single entity that happens to have all the sort of individual parts within it. And I think the latter way, the collective entity being the primary aspect, is very common in a lot of nationalistic thought, therefore in a lot of Zionistic thought, and really in a lot of things that Rav Kook wrote. We talked about Knesset Yisrael, the sort of collective, mystical, entity that is the people of Israel. You really get a sense that it's this whole individual thing that really certainly on the stage of history, seems to take precedence over the individual Jews of the people of Israel. And this piece is really pushing back in the opposite direction. It is the fact that we've neglected individuals and failed to give any sort of importance to individuals is in fact holding back the collective entity that is the nation of Israel.
I know in the religious Zionist world today, which their main thing was Am Yisrael and make Aliyah. Today we're seeing a big, it seems almost like a rebellion, like a lot of focus on individual meaning today. I even see it in the Haredi world as well. There's like this very strong emphasis on Breslov, on Rabbi Nachman, on Rav Fruman, Rav Shagar, and I think it's almost like Rav Kook in this piece is predicting that, like, if we go so far in focusing on the collective Am Yisrael community, do what the community says, go to shul because that's what the right thing is for the Jewish people, don't assimilate because that would be bad for the Jewish people. When there's no individual meaning in your Judaism, everything falls apart. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that phenomena in Israel right now that we're seeing, that so many people, I think in the Haredi world as well, but also in the Dati Lumi, are so excited about rabbis who talk about individual meaning.
I think a lot of it is about shifting understandings, not necessarily as much of the individual, that's part of it, so much as the way we relate to the collective. Rav Kook at the beginning of the 20th century is trying to navigate the tensions between like nationalism and romanticism and very personal individual focus that is best expressed in his diaries. The fact that he was like writing diaries, he was very concerned with what's going on within himself as an individual. And the fact that he sees importance to the broader nation that he's a part of and really sees being part of that nation as an important part of him, let alone being part of humanity and the world as a whole.
Yeah.
And throughout the 20th century, and certainly by the end of the 20th century, in a lot of the world, but particularly here in Israel, the collective does not necessarily form as much as important a part of people's identity. It's not gone, not by a long shot, but people have a much stronger sense of personal identity in contrast to a now weaker sense of collective identity. So suddenly you have people, throughout the various communities who need some sort of explanation of the role of the individual in Torah and what Torah has to say about the individual. And you have people who are feeling that need. Teachers like Rav Shagar and Rav Fruman are trying to do that, and contemporary teachers are doing that with Rav Shagar and Rav Fruman, but also with appealing to Breslov or Rav Kook or whatever in a much more personal, individualistic mode.
But you could see that there's this overall emphasis. I think it's even in America. In Yeshiva University, there's also this strong emphasis today on Hasidus. Rav Moshe Weinberger is a big influence there. And it's amazing how the individual has been neglected for so long, and it is coming back to bite the Jewish community. If people don't feel a sense that Judaism is doing something in a relevant way to them, then they find it hard to hang on. I want to read another piece. It's the first piece in the book. It's from Shmona Kvatzim. I just want to make it clear, the diary entries of Rav Kook are not like Dear Diary. They're like spiritual entries that Rav Kook wrote. He would carry a notebook with him at all times. You can see, I'll show you a picture of it. If you go to page 5, Levi, you can see Rav Kook has this notebook he's holding. I think that was taken in Switzerland, when Rav Kook was in Switzerland. And so he had this notebook, and he would always write in them. And throughout his life, he's developing his thoughts, and he's always writing them down. Okay, so this is from his notebooks. When we forget the individual soul, when we stop paying attention to the inner life of the person, everything becomes confusing and unclear. Therefore, the beginning of tshuva is a return to oneself, to the source of one's soul. Returning to oneself leads one to immediately return to God, to the soul of souls. In this way, one will grow higher and higher in holiness and purity. This principle is true for the transformation of the individual, the nation, humanity, and all of existence. All destruction comes about only because we have forgotten and ignored the self. In fact, if a person expresses a desire to return to God, but is not interested in focusing on the self, then this is a fake and deceitful type of tshuva, through which one takes the name of God in vain. Therefore, only in the great truth of returning to oneself will the individual, the nation, humanity, and all of existence return to its Creator, to the light of life. This is the secret of the light of the Mashiach, that in his illumination the entire world will return to its source. Okay, Levi, so in this piece, it's an amazing thing Rav Kook does. He thinks on every level, whether or not it's the individual, whether or not it's the nation, it's humanity, we all have to be coming back to ourselves. And he doesn't think of it as selfish. He actually thinks you're taking God's name in vain, which is a very strong language because that's the 10 Commandments. You're taking God's name in vain if you say, I'm going to become more connected to God, but I'm not going to be more connected to myself. So maybe you can talk a little bit about, what do you think Rav Kook is trying to get at in this piece? Why does he think, people have this tendency to ignore themselves for the sake of religion, and why he thinks, no, we have to come back to ourself. Self-expression, individual meaning is not irreligious.
So I'm not sure he says anything here about why people ignore the self. But it would seem, presumably, to start with a misunderstanding of the role of the self. That people who ignore the self do so because they don't understand that tshuva, returning to God, is something that you do by returning to the self, which involves some degree of identification of the self as divine, as God is manifest within the self. And that's true on the individual level, but also he says here on the level of the nation and humanity and reality as a whole. That while the individual has to return to themselves and to be more authentic in order to be more divine and to be return to God, so does everything. So does the nation, so does all people as a collective whole, and so does all of existence. Because God is manifest in all of those levels.
Yeah.
And the idea that God isn't manifest in those levels, that all of those things are somehow secular. The self, the nation, human existence, reality are empty of God, and you only find God in some other location outside that, such as the Torah. It's a very sort of classic idea from, say, Nefesh HaChaim, who does a lot of work to construct that sort of theology that leads you to say, okay, in order to return to God, I have to return to the Torah. And Rav Kook is pushing back, saying that return to God means returning to the godliness within the self, the nation, etc.
I want to unpack for a second the idea of returning to the self for the nation. I find this fascinating thought of Rav Kook, that assimilation, in other words, giving up your Jewish identity, which is a national thing, is actually a sense of giving up the self. In other words, just like if you would conform as an individual and say, I want to be like somebody else, I don't like who I am, Rav Kook would say, no, you should love who you are. There's something unique about who you are. So too, on a national level, to assimilate, to say, I don't like being Jewish, I wish I was, American more, I wish I was, I'm embarrassed about my Jewish identity, that is a form of conformity, and you're losing your godliness. So for Rav Kook, like, nationalism, being connected to Am Yisrael, or I guess in Rav Shagar's language, like your Brit, your connection, your covenant with the Torah and mitzvot, which is a national thing because it's Jewish, Jewish language, is an expression of the self for you.
Well, I'm not sure I would connect to Rav Shagar's Brit. I agree that Rav Shagar's understanding of Brit in language is sort of parallel to Rav Kook's understanding of being part of the nation. But this is what I was getting at before in terms of Rav Kook having a sense that the nation is this essential entity unto itself, that you are on one level just a branch of one small segment of this larger entity. Right. As very clear from this piece, he also has a strong sense that you're a unique self and you're your own entity, even in the abstract from that nation. But an important part of who you are is being part of a collective entity, and just that entity has a specific nature. In one of his letters on tolerance, Rav Kook talks, I think it's letter 20, Rav Kook talks about the degree to which there can be pluralism of ideas within a collective, and says basically everyone can be as pluralistic as they want except the Jewish people who have a single dogma, which is the unity of God, because that is the underlying principle of the existence of the people. The Jewish people exist entirely about and for the purpose of expressing and conveying the idea that God is one. And he has a very broad idea of what that means,
right.
But relevant to our discussion, that's what it means to be part of the nation of Israel, is to be somehow in relationship to that idea that God is one.
And that spiritual mission.
So that's your spiritual mission, and if you give up on that, you're assimilating.
Yeah.
But as long as you hold on to that, Rav Kook actually seemed to be very tolerant of other forms of difference. But I think I'd say it's not just about your personal covenant with God and who you are as a person, but you're really part of the broader group that is trying to express the oneness of God.
Well, I think I totally agree with your description of what it means to be connected to Am Yisrael and nationalism. But again, I think what is unique about this piece is the framing of the nation as the self. In other words, returning to your source for Rav Kook is everything. In other words, selfishness is not a word we see in Rav Kook's writings, anchiyut, because he really doesn't think it's a negative thing to be returning inwardly, and he thinks actually if you are more connected to yourself, you'll want to help people more. He talks a lot about that. But I think nationalism for Rav Kook is not sacrificing the self for the nation. It's an expression of the self, and that I am part of this body. So it wouldn't be Rav David Aaron's famous metaphor about the hand, and how the hand is not in contradiction to the other parts of the body. It's an expression of the body. So when the hand moves, the whole body is happy for it.
Right. So I like to think about it geometrically.
Yeah.
I like to imagine concentric circles. So you can imagine with the system he laid out here, a circle for all of existence, a slightly smaller circle for humanity, a slightly smaller circle for nationalism, and a smaller still for the individual. And you could participate in nationalism outside of the circle of the individual, and for Kook, you would have to do tshuva, to return to yourself. But within the circle of yourself, you can participate in nationalism. Right. And in fact, if you don't do that, you haven't really connected to yourself, because in order to get outside of the nationalistic circle, you also have to get outside of the circle of yourself.
Well, that's a beautiful idea, and I guess I want to do a whole recording about the 4-part song, because that's kind of connected to that. But I think that's an amazing thing that you picked up on, that Rav Kook really thinks the self wants to do much more than just individual meaning. But individual meaning is not the lowest level. Really, everything comes back to the source of who you are. So when I'm singing, Hatikva on Yom HaAtzmaut, that expresses something so deep in me. And when I see races in the world and it hurts me at the core, that's also an expression of myself, because that's humanity, and I'm part of humanity. And when I see animals, treated badly, that also hurts me at the core, because I'm part of creation. So for Rav Kook, it's all about returning to the source, and the source is something which is relevant to all parts of life.